Alright, yo, what's up? Okay, so in this video I'm just going to go over the logs that I've captured from the track day earlier in this week. Most track days, in fact all track days, I have the ECU, so it's logging all the sensors on the engine, so I can look back at the data, which I'm going to do right now, and just make sure everything's working as expected. So the things that I normally have a look at are air fuel ratio, oil pressure, exhaust gas temp. Because I've got drive-by-wire on this car as well, I'm still learning how to sort of play around with that as well. So I've got accelerator pedal sensors, and I've got slider position sensors, and I've got a bit of configuration on the ECU as well, which plays with that. So yeah, just have a look into the ECU. I'm going to connect to the ECU right now. I'm just going to swap over from this GoPro to some software that I've got on the computer, which will hopefully give you a better, clearer image, and hopefully be able to see what I'm doing. Alright, car's on, connecting now. Takes a while with the Haltech. It's one thing that frustrates me with it. The rest of the ECU, from my limited knowledge, is really capable and really good. Alright, I'll fast forward this bit. Okay, you can see down here it's still connecting, downloading bit by bit. What I will show whilst I can is if we just look at the drive-by-wire, the way I have it customized at the moment, so max TPS, let's wait for it to load. Right, so you can basically see here that the drive-by-wire, this is basically the maximum throttle position allowed by the ECU. So regardless of what my foot's doing, if my foot is fully flat down, 100% throttle at 9,700 RPM, well, the ECU is going to only open the throttles 50% anyway. So this is the way I've got it currently configured, and this is what I had at Hampton Downs the other day. Now you can see on the back straights, top of third gear, I'm just flooring it as much as I can, but the engine's not actually revving any higher, and that's because of this here. Basically, you can see that at 9,300 RPM the throttles are only open 80%, and at 9,400 the throttles are 55%, and anything above that is 50%. So what you'll find is down the back straights from the top of third gear, it's just the RPM's hanging here because the throttles are just basically closing, and that's really just to protect the head, the shims inside the buckets. I don't run bucketless shimless buckets in this RB26 head. I just have shims still, and I know that if I'm gentle to the head with no big limiters and I do stuff like this, I know it will be reliable. So let's open up the logs, let's export the logs to the Datalog viewer, and we'll go through bits and pieces. Hampton, July 15. In fact, I've already got the logs there. Let's just reopen them anyway. So this is now just exporting the log file from the ECU to the Haltech log viewer, which is actually quite a handy piece of software. It really gives me some insight to the health of the engine and how it's running after each track day, and I normally try to do this each time, along with Brian, who also has a look at the logs too. We're pretty in tune with this engine and what normal operating parameters looks like. So let's just see how it's how it was running at Hampton Downs the other day, because it got a solid beating. It was in the revs, it was making reasonable amounts of boost, and it didn't miss a beat really, except for the alternator, which is not really the engine's fault. That's just a bolt-on part which I can replace pretty easy. Alright, so we're loaded up. So normally what I do first is just chuck the RPM in there so I can see what engine RPM the car's doing. So we can see that the track the other day, the highest RPM it saw was 9,842, and at the moment where I've got my mouse, you can see that this thing moving back and forth here. You can see the RPM there, so you can see as it goes up through the revs. Other thing I normally do is just chuck a gear on top of it so I can kind of see where I am. What I'm trying to find is some of these back straight pulls where I was just going as hard as I could down the back straight. So here's a good example right here, right? So what we can see is coming through third gear, see the line here, the green line, you can also see it there. The car's just hanging at 9,300 RPM, in that kind of high RPM range. Now most likely that's the drive-by-wire holding the car off the throttle. Now we can check that by chucking in the throttle position sensor, so this will show us where the actual throttles are. So the throttle's around about 80%, give or take. And if I can look at my accelerator pedal, this is actually where I am with my foot. Well, you can see that I'm flooring it. So I've got my foot 100% throttle. So this is 100% and down here is 0%. So you can basically see that, and you can also see the number here. So drive-by-wire accelerator pedal position. I'm at 100% throttle. I'm trying to give it death, but the throttle is actually at 68% and the RPM is at 9,361. So if we just go back to that screen over here, max TPS, 9,361 RPM. It's getting close to 9,400. The ECU says once you're at 9,400 you should be at only 55% throttle. I'm at full throttle of my foot, but the throttles are at 68%, so they're sort of going down and down and down until the RPM starts to drop a little bit. As it is now, then the throttles are opening back up again. So it's just basically this whole mechanism of the drive-by-wire is just hanging, letting the engine hang, and you can hear that in this video. So we can see the drive-by-wire as I just described before. The computer is controlling the throttles regardless of what my foot is doing. So for the most part you can kind of see the throttles are following my foot. There's a bit of a delay with the throttle, but we're talking, this is half of a second, so this is 0.5 of a second, 500 milliseconds. So it's, to me as a driver, it's completely unnoticeable. I think the drive-by-wire is just amazing, and I'm so glad that I did it, because I can do all this sort of stuff. It's completely transformed the car, and it's enabled me to actually have such a big turbo on the car. With the G42, it's a 1200 horsepower turbo, and this engine's 2.7 litre. It's 2,739 cc, so it's not exactly a big engine, but if it wants to sit on the rev limiter. So without the drive-by-wire, I'm not sure how reliable this engine would be, but with it, it seems to be under it's under a lot of control, because it never really hits the rev limiter, and because the head doesn't have shimless buckets in it, they're just still buckets with shims in them. I need to be quite careful that I don't spit shims. So let's have a look at the oil pressure. So let's just get rid of gear, we don't need that. What we should be seeing with oil pressure is a correlation between the engine RPM and the oil pressure. So this is a good example. The engine's just sitting hard on 9,000 RPM. Oil pressure is sitting around about 90 psi, and that's pretty much bang on. Like, my understanding is the ideal is 10 psi per 1,000 RPM, so we've got good oil pressure up here. What I was seeing the other week when I was having oil pressure issues was I'd be cruising around up here, and all of a sudden the oil pressure would just dive, and then the ECU would cut it because there's an oil pressure sensor cut here, which so yeah, oil pressure is good. Let's just have a look later on in the day to confirm that we're not seeing any change of oil pressure throughout the day. So what do we got here? 5,000 RPM, 70 psi. Probably a little bit much pressure down there, but I don't think too much pressure is going to hurt. It's probably a good thing. The correlation of the line of the oil pressure to the RPM. So the RPM is the blue line, the pink line is the oil pressure. The correlation is about the same, so we're seeing the same sort of behavior. Let's take a look at the we'll keep the RPM, and we'll get manifold pressure, boost pressure, so we'll chuck that in there. We'll keep the drive-by-wire throttle position sensor. Let's make a new trace page. So if we go to RPM, boost pressure, and nitrous, when is the nitrous spraying? So you can see these yellow lines here. This shows when the nitrous spray is on or off. Down the bottom is off, up the top is on. So we can see that, and let's just chuck a gear in there so we've got an idea of where we're at. And let's just try to find those high RPM. A few nitrous sprays around here, so you can see, you know, a nitrous spray, we're talking like on average, like here's a big spray here. In terms of seconds, we're talking, so it's 11.5 seconds, 12 seconds, 5 minutes. So we're talking, you know, it's spraying for like 300 milliseconds, 0.3 of a second. Let's just see how that impacts the boost. Well, this example is not a good example because the RPM is, let's just put TPS accelerator pedal position in there as well. So I've taken my foot off the accelerator. So this is when it's up here, my foot is full throttle. When it's down here, my foot is not full throttle. So I went full throttle for a moment. The nitrous sprayed. The boost started to come up, and then I just took my foot off the gas. So it's not a good example. Let's see if I can find somewhere where the nitrous jumps up, helps the boost come on. So here's an example of me cruising at 5,000 RPM. I put my foot down. The boost is at 5 psi at the moment. RPM is 4,600. I'm in 4th gear. Accelerator pedal 100%. The boost is low. The nitrous sprays. The RPM starts to come up. Over a period of 0.5 of a second, the RPM's gone up to 8,000 and we're at 25 psi boost. So that little nudge there of the nitrous, just enough to kind of get the turbo on song. Over a period of 0.5 of a second, we've gone from in 4th gear to 4,800 all the way through to 8,200 RPM, 25 psi boost, and it ran all the way up to 27 psi boost in that example. If we just look at the nitrous engagement parameters, we can see where how it's been configured. Stages. So I've got a single stage. I've only got one nitrous fogger jet in this car. It's a 47 jet. It's about 100 shot of nitrous. It's pretty cheap and economical. Like a 10-pound tank would probably last me 12, probably 14 sets of tires. So whatever that works out to be. But just look at the engagement parameters. So basically, these lists of numbers here are the required conditions for the nitrous to spray, and that basically says that if the engine is at minimum 65 degrees, the boost pressure is above 1 psi but less than 19 psi, and the RPM is above 2,200 but less than 5,800, and the TPS, the throttle position sensor, is 80% or more. I might just change it to 70. Then the nitrous will spray. So that's kind of cool. I'm a big fan of nitrous. I couldn't use this car, I couldn't drift this car without nitrous because that turbo is just lazy. Once it's on boost, the transient response is really good, but the coming on boost, because it's only a 2739cc engine with about 9:1 compression, it's a bit lazy. So let's have a look at boost pressure for the day. So you can see 8,000 RPM, 22, 23 psi. As the revs go up, sort of around that 24 psi mark. So it'll be interesting to see how this car goes on, say, 30 or 35 psi in 4th gear down those back straights, because in the car with just me in it, it's pretty quick. Let's create a new trace page and let's look at the exhaust gas temperatures. what I'm looking for here is just to see that the correlation between all cylinders is, within sort of 50 degrees of each other. I'm also looking to see what the maximum temperature for each cylinder was for the day, and you can see that there, which is 895 degrees was the hottest temperature that we saw, which looks like it was around about here. So somewhere there we got to 893, which is quite warm. So let's just have a look at the RPM at that time, and also the gear I was in. So 5th gear. This will probably be me doing a pull down one of the back straights. In fact, we'll just confirm that by my accelerator position. So you can confirm that. Look at my foot. So I'm foot flat, for quite a long period of time. 4th gear. Revs are coming up. Exhaust gas temperature burn is 860 degrees. 5th gear, back on the gas again. Big load. It's seen 893 degrees. Come off the gas. The exhaust gas temps drop. Let's just check the wideband O2 sort of at the same time. So if we just go put an overlay of the actual air fuel ratio at that time, so 0.81, bang on, that's a really good number. I think that's close to 12 to 1, maybe a little bit 11, high 11s, I think, which is good. There's always a little bit of delay with the wideband. It's, you just take it on face value, give or take, basically, but that's looking good, pretty good to me. So EGTs are all good, so I can see between the coldest cylinder, which is 849 degrees, and the hottest cylinder, which is 873, as well as across the day, 895 to 867. We're within 30 degrees of each other across all cylinders. That's pretty good. When I was looking at this graph probably, 2 track days ago, I noticed there's 100 degrees discrepancy on the EGT temperatures, and so I took my injectors in to get them flow tested, and there's 25% variance across my injectors. So it's good to see that this is the first time I've actually had these cleaned injectors in. It's good to see that the EGTs are within 50 degrees of each other, in fact more like 30 degrees, which is pretty cool. Let's just take a look at the coolant temperature. At this time we know that we are under 4th gear, big pull, we're going hard. Let's just check the water temperatures, overlay that. So 80 degrees, 88 degrees, 89. There's nothing wrong with those sorts of temps. Those are good temps. You can see they got to 120 degrees in the day. I don't remember seeing that. Let's just zoom out and have a look. Why? Well, that looks like when the car was off. So the car engine RPM, it's idling. I'll just turn it off, and then it's just shot up to 120 degrees. I'm pretty sure some of these sensors, when they are not being used, go to earth or whatever, I don't know exactly, but they just show erroneous readings like this, so whatever. The main thing is that I didn't see any high oil, water temps at the track the other day. Just check the oil temps as well. So I've got oil temperature here, I'll overlay that onto the water. So the highest water temp we saw, once again 120, but that's not correct because the engine is doing the same thing as the water temp sensor. Let's just try find a period where we know that EGTs were hot back here, and up here EGTs were hot. That this is the 5th gear, 4th gear, 5th gear pull, and the oil temps are sort of like 78, 90, 80 degrees basically. So it was all good. So I didn't see any temperature issues at the track the other day, probably helped by the fact it was only like 3 degrees anyway, so that's pretty cool. Do one more overlay. Just going to check RPM versus battery voltage. I had those issues at the track some time ago, particularly at Pukekohe, where the alternator was spinning too fast and I was losing voltage. So here's a good example. Engine's at 9,300 RPM. I'm just going to chuck the battery voltage as a new thing down here on top of it. So, I'm at 9,000 RPM, I've got a solid 14 volts. That's perfect. Nothing wrong with that. I do notice that later in the day though, the alternator decided to die. You see this. The RPM is going up, the voltages are like 10 volts, 9 volts, 10 volts. The car was, I could hear it was running different. I pulled out. I didn't put any of those videos online, but this is pretty much what ended our day, is the fact that this alternator said nah. Finally, let's just check the boost pressure that we're running for the day. Brian from NDT has set up closed loop boost control. Sorry, that's idle. Where's boost? Target pressure. So basically, if I want to start playing around with boost, if I'm like, okay, sweet, well, I want 28 pound, I'll just come in here and change this to 28 pound. But as you can also see, what I'm doing is the track data today, it looks like I was actually only running 22 pound of boost. I was aiming for a target of 22 pound of boost. By the time it got to 9,500, the boost was trailing off to 18 psi. So that's just the idea behind that, is just to reduce a little bit of EMAP, exhaust manifold back pressure between the valves and the turbine wheel and the exhaust manifold. I've got a big exhaust housing on this, well, not that big, it's a 1.01, but the turbo is a big turbo, it's a big frame turbo, so EMAP on this engine I don't think is much of an issue. However, because as I said before, we still run those shims in the head, we don't have bucketless, shimless buckets. I want to basically pull the boost out. So you can basically see if the engine does get to 9,700 RPM, the boost goes back to wastegate pressure, which is 12 psi, and that's just a nice way to remove EMAP from the exhaust manifold, and if it does get to the rev limiter, it's a much softer blow. Alright, sweet, so I hope that was helpful to you. It's good for me because now I know that the engine is healthy, its car's running strong. You know, I was beating on the car pretty hard the other day at the track, so yeah, it looks like it's good to go for next time. Big thanks to Brian from NDT. He is my dyno tuner and he's been tuning this car for a very long time. He's much more in tune with the engine than I am, obviously, because he dyno tunes every day. But yeah, this thing hasn't really missed a beat because of his tuning, so thanks mate. We'll be on track again soon. Thanks for watching.